Welcome to everyone. As unusual recording and unusual lecturing, we have decided together that it would be far more useful for all of us if I give the lecture in English instead of Hungarian. So first, a short introduction of this lecture series. This lecture series focusing on the modern colonial empires and their success and also their failures. And why we are focusing only on the modern empires, because although the Roman Empire in many aspects used to be a kind of model for the modern empires, the comparison probably useless for all of us. This lecture series' main aim is going to be an understanding in depth how the empires were born, what means that an empire was flourishing, and what elements used to lead their failures. Now, step by step, we first define and shed light on the motivation of creating an empire. We must make a very careful distinction, and that is that we can label three types of empires. One is the informal empire. The informal empire, neither legal nor long existing type of empires. For example, the informal empire, which used to be both in India and in Japan. In India by the British, in Japan by the Japanese. Building an empire informally meant at least three things. From the British side, we used to call it the harbor empire or trade empire. And quoting a British expert in the early 19th century, trade is nothing else but using skillfully or weapons. So the trading empires belonging under the label of informal empires, Japan used to send and dispatching many Japanese citizens to the targeted territories in the neighborhood in Asia. And these informal empires also included various enormously large borderless companies operation. The Dutch set up the East Indian company, which became a colonial company working in Indonesia, Sumatra, Burma. Nowadays, we call it in Indonesia, and all over the larger Asia. Japan set up the South Manchurian Railways, which also had these kind of empire building function. And actually the South Manchurian Railway Company was mirroring the East Indian Company because they also spread their activity in many fields, not only infrastructure, not only export-import, but also investments and research institute. So the informal stage, not all the cases, but most of the cases led the actual physical colonization, or as the Japanese language tend to call it, annexation. Sometimes it didn't call or wasn't called as colony, but annexed territories, such as Manchuria was annexed or attached to the Japanese metropole. Sometimes in the British Empire, many fields in Southeast Asia used to be called as not real colonial territory, but only occupied by British forces and administration. And the legally acknowledged colonization, which was only rare because only the British, the French, and for a time being, the Dutch, not the Spanish or the Portuguese colonial empires were accepted as legally ruled colonial territories. Now, one more information on the type of colonies, and that is the financial colonization. The financial colonization was typical or a very deep and long-lasting characteristic of the United States of America, where very few territories were literally occupied either by war, like the south of the United States, which means New Mexico, or the Philippines, but mainly and mostly the United States of America administration and government colonized various territories in Asia and in Latin America via setting up the dollar as the key currency in those territories. They used to call it, based on an excellent historical account, the financial doctors. Stabilizing a country financial system basically meant that this country had to be open to the United States export and import activity. Now, after we acknowledging this type of colonization stages, the fundamental question is why a country decides to occupy other territories. It could be motivated by lack of labor, such as the slavery period was after the great geographical discoveries. Sometimes it could be motivated lack of raw materials, and sometimes it could be motivated, very, very importantly, the lack of markets domestically, therefore the cheap import expanding at the same time from the colonized territories, the big export markets in various territories, including Africa, Asia, and South America. Don't forget Latin America. Now, the next thing which we may ask, how this colonizing period came to the European countries, or better to say dynasty-led territories. the colonization fundamentally and originally was driven both discovering new territories and new populace, and at the same time expanding the country assets, which came as an additional asset from the colonized territories. And sometimes the colonization was nothing else but competing with other colonizing nations. Now, we can view the colonization in two quite distinct ways. One is that the colonization originally being driven by curiosity, by expanding knowledge, and by having new raw materials and additional free of charge labor, like the slavery used to be. That is one distinct view on the colonizing motivation. The other one is quite different from the first one, and that is that the colonization is nothing else but the white Europe dominating will on the non-white continents. Of course, when we are talking about the second view, on the 16th century, it was rarely labeled or wasn't labeled at all as racist motivation or drive, but instead it was from the 12th century all over the 16th and 17th century religiously motivated will, and that was in simple way to put and summarizing the Christianism in Europe was superior religion in comparison to the soon discovered other continents' religions. And one extreme example, if you watch the film, I think Scorsese made it on the abandoned and tortured and prohibited Christianism in Japan, what the Portuguese did bring to Japan, and it was a very deep motivation for the Japanese central government to prohibit all the European armies and all the European ships and all the European visitors in Japan, because the Christianism was endangering the centralized power of the military state of Japan. And therefore, it was a competing alternative in comparison to the Shintoism and the Buddhism in Japan. Now, the Christianism superiority actually was put into practice as crusades. Most of the Christian countries in Europe took very deep and efficient part in the various crusades for almost 200 years in Central Asia, between Europe and Asia. And the result was partially in Italy, the city-states like Venice, Florence, and other city-states ballooning wealthiness. And the other part of Europe also had enormous economic, financial, and trade gains as a result of the Crusades. Please note that the Crusades also used local people in the occupied territories as slaves in Europe. You can see in the 16th, 17th century chronics that actually they used to paint and draw many non-white people as in various dynasty places, and even in the 18th century in Hungary, which was the Austrian Empire part mainly, that time also few scattered but non-white people appear, and as a result, when the great discoveries were completed, the Crusade prepared the big colonization waves for the ruling economic and financial powers in Europe. Now, we may add to this relatively simply understood historical process one element, and that is that the colonization hidden sub motivation being also a kind of knowledge competing with the non-European knowledge, which means that many countries, including the Netherlands, at that time they used to call it lowlands, the Spanish, the Portuguese, also did bring enormous knowledge from the Crusade territories and also later from the discovered new lands, because the European superiority included to get knowledge from the colonized territories without acknowledging it. So therefore, it was a physical, economic, financial, social, and intellectual colonization. And this package of colonization led basically the European superiority until today. So we call it nowadays Europe, or if you want, you can call it European Union, but that's not covering the whole Europe as geographical unit. And Europe, undoubtedly, most countries of Europe believe that their knowledge, their intellectual assets since the 12th, 13th century, basically being created by themselves without interacting the outside of Europe territories. Now, that's not true. That's not true primarily because thanks to Asia, in less extent Africa and Central Asia, the European import not only of items like spices, silk, luxury goods, which were rapidly spreading all over Europe, but also the knowledge what the various adventurous people did bring back, first from the Netherlands, then from Portugal, then from Spain, basically was amalgamated into the European knowledge. Now, finally, I would like to say one less known but very important element of this imported knowledge from the non-European territories. We are human beings, and we always selecting new things according to our existing knowledge. We cannot discover certain new things without linking to our existing knowledge. Therefore, the selection of the European people who went for various adventures to non-European territories were quite strange. And the next lecture will prove, I hope, that this selective imported knowledge actually made very strong the belief and then the creation of the concept that the European white population undoubtedly superior to the Asian and other seen and later colonized territories. Thank you for your attention. Bye.